Hello, my name is Cara Judea Alhadeff, and I will be presenting Climate Justice Now, Transforming the Anthropocene into the Ecozoic Era. And the paintings you will see in my presentation are by Micaela Amato, who is the artist in my book, Zazu Dreams, Between the Scarab and the Dung Beetle, a cautionary fable for the Anthropocene era. And all of the photographs, the analog color photographs you will see are by me that I shot. So Climate Justice Now, performing or transforming the Anthropocene into the Ecozoic era, asks, how can citizen activists actualize symbiotic solutions as we transition from our petroleum-pharmaceutical-addicted cyberculture to an economics of solidarity? How can we joyfully inspire, educate, and mobilize collective action among peoples of diverse backgrounds? Through an urgent commitment to creative waste collaborations, we can transform corporate capitalism's everyday violence, consumption, and entitlement, creating a bridge between infrastructural change and individual responsibility that gleans from indigenous wisdom and earth-based perspectives. Transitioning from our ethnocentric, xenophobic Anthropocene era that includes plutocrat-driven corporatocracies embedded in bacteriophobia, commercialized childhood, extractive industries, GMOs, into a biophilic social permaculture requires an embodied awareness of interdependency rooted in the commons. This is a foundation for the Ecozoic Era, Thomas Berry's concept that humans can share mutually beneficial relationships with the world around us, intellectually, structurally, and spiritually. One perceived solution to help us transition is to create alternatives to fossil fuel-addicted economies, as proposed, for example, through the Green New Deal and its focus on allegedly renewable energies. However well-intentioned, these supposed alternatives perpetuate the violence of wasteful behavior and destructive infrastructures. Even if temporarily abated, they ultimately conserve the original crisis. This collusion includes privatization of every corporeal and planetary so-called resource, quote unquote, reducing the commons to privately owned commodities. This collusion also includes compulsory Eurocentric model education and the entrapments of convenience culture. Within this corporate-led consumerism, individualism is valorized, while intimacy, connection, is vilified. As with climate crisis injustices, communities that are the least responsible for these calamities are the hardest hit. We must practice caution during our transition out of our global petroculture, not based on the motivation, but on the underlying false assumptions and strategies that perceived sustainability agendas offer. At this juncture of geopolitical, ecological, social, and corporeal catastrophes, we must critically question clean, green solutions, such as the erroneously named renewable energies revolution. I suggest we face both the roots and the implications of how perceived solutions to our climate crisis, like quote-unquote renewable energies, may unintentionally sustain ecological devastation and global wealth inequities, and actually divert us from establishing long-term regenerative infrastructures. On the surface, sustainability agendas appear to offer critical shifts toward an ecologically, economically, and ethically sound society. But there is much evidence to prove that, number one, these structural changes must be accompanied by a psychological shift in individuals' behavior to effectively shut down consumer waste, convenience culture, And number two, the core of too many green, clean solutions is rooted in the very essence of our climate crisis: privatized, industrialized corporate capitalism. For example, Eric Chaffetz alerts us about the Green New Deal. He says the Green New Deal is, quote, a capitalist solution to a capitalist problem, end quote. It claims to avoid the linked oppressions of wealth inequity and climate crisis, yet its proposed solutions avoid the very roots of each crisis. My challenge for today is rooted in three interrelated inquiries. Number one, how are our daily choices reinforcing the very systems we are questioning or even trying to dismantle? Number two, how are the alternatives to fossil fuel economies and environmental racism reinforcing the very systems we are questioning or even trying to dismantle? And number three, what can we learn from indigenous philosophies and social ecofeminist theories in order to establish viable, sustainable, regenerative infrastructures, an Ecozoic Era? As we transition to supposedly carbon-free electricity, we must be attentive to the ways in which we unconsciously manifest the very racist hegemonies we seek to dislodge. We must be conscious of the greening of capitalism that manifests as green colonialism through a new dependency on what is falsely identified as renewable energies. Currently, human and natural world habitat destruction are implicit in the mass, underline mass, production and disposal infrastructures of most renewable energies: solar, wind, biomass, biofuels, geothermal, and other ostensible renewables. This includes our technocratic petroleum-pharmaceutical addictions that use technologies to create equality. Even if policy appears to be in alignment with environmental ethics, we are consistently finding that policy change simply replaces one hegemony with another, particularly within the framework of neoliberal globalization. Only when we acknowledge the roots of our Western imperialist crisis can we begin to decolonize and revitalize all people's livelihoods and their environments. Zazu Dreams, my climate justice book that explores the perils of the Anthropocene, challenges cultural habits deeply embedded in our calamitous trajectory toward global ecological and cultural ethnic collapse. The book's main character reflects, quote, we have this crazy idea that anything green is good, but we know that there is no clear-cut good and evil. What happens when the very solution causes more problems than the original problem it was supposed to fix? End quote. How we measure our ecological footprint and global biocapacity is often riddled with paradox, particularly in the face of green colonialism, or what I call humanitarian imperialism. The litany of our collusion with corporate forms of domination is infinite within the Anthropocene era, increasingly characterized as the Plasticine. Disinformation campaigns spread by fossil fuel interests deeply root us in assimilationist consumerism. The Zazu Dreams characters witness social and environmental costs of subjugating others through both fossil fuel-obsessed economies and their green replacements. Vaclav Smil warns us of this, quote-unquote, miasma of falsehood. This implies replacing one destructive socializing norm, in this case petropharma cultures sustained by fossil fuel-addicted economies, with another, purportedly renewable energies. These energies, or many of them, many of the most prominent ones, I don't call them renewable because they are not, like fossil fuels, are rooted in violent colonialist extractive industries. In Deep Green Resistance, Lierre Keith reminds us, quote, we can't consume our way out of environmental collapse. Consumption is the problem, end quote. Even within the 99%, consumers are capitalism. The 99%, of course, is referring to the Occupy movement. Consumers are capitalism. Without convenience culture, mass consumer demand, the machine of the profit-driven free market would have to shift gears. We can't blame oil companies without simultaneously implicating ourselves, holding our consumption habits equally responsible. And of course, the whole idea of free market in this context needs to be investigated. How can we insist government and transnational corporations be accountable when we refuse to curb our own buying, usal, and disposal habits? We don't have to go far back in cross-cultural histories of nonviolent resistance and civil disobedience to learn from world-changing examples of strikes, unions, boycotts, expropriation, infrastructural sabotage, embargoes, and divestment protests. Yet, most contemporary transition movements are founded in the very system they are trying to dismantle. Our perceived resources, these alternative forms of energy proposed to power our public electrical grids, are misidentified under the misleading misnomers, labels such as renewable, sustainable, clean, green. How is clean defined? For whom? There is not a clear division between clean energy, dirty power. Clean isn't always clean. Neoliberal denial of corporeal and global interrelationships instills conformist laws of conduct that continually replenish our toxic soup in which we all live. Additionally, Vandana Shiva, as so many Indigenous activists, reminds us that the concept of resources itself is rooted in capitalist, industrial, colonialist histories. An amazing resource for that discussion is from the Development Dictionary. Now I will address specific technologies that are falsely identified as renewable energy, technologies that actually reinforce the very problem they are trying to solve. Number 1, solar, photovoltaic, and wind technologies. Given these proposed solutions, Western imperialism has and will continue to dominate global relations. Western imperialism is implicit in solar cell and storage production and disposal infrastructures. For instance, clean energy easily gets soiled when it is implemented on an industrial scale. Industrial wind farms, aka blenders in the sky, chopping up migrating birds and bats, use exorbitant resources to produce and implement both the wind turbines and their infrastructure and devastate migrating wildlife. In this case, bats and birds, along with insects and butterflies, critical to healthy ecosystems and some of whom are endangered species. Both wind and solar energies require vast quantities of fossil fuels to implement them on a grand scale. As we have seen throughout both California and China, two examples among too many, massive solar energy sites, solar industrial complexes, strip land bare, displacing human populations and migration routes of both wildlife and people for acres of solar fields, substations, and access roads, all of which require incredibly carbon-intensive concrete, consuming massive tracts of land. 100 to 1,000 times more land area is required for wind and solar, as well as for biofuel energy production, than does fossil fuel production. Number 2, hydropower technology. Large-scale dams for hydropower have also historically had cataclysmic effects on indigenous peoples and their lands. Although macro hydro, like fracking, has finally been recognized for its calamitous consequences, perversely, it is still proposed as a viable alternative to fossil fuel economies. Number 3, battery technology. Let's begin with a California-based scenario. According to the Union of Concerned Scientists and their Climate Vulnerability Index, In California, fine particulate pollution harms African American communities 43% more than predominantly white communities, Latinx 39% more, and Asian American communities 21% more. As if tailpipe emissions are the only humanitarian catastrophe, one clean solution, quote unquote, clean, is the electric vehicle for public transportation and for personal consumption. Completely ignoring the embodied energy involved, this perceived solution displaces the costs of environmental racism, once again exported out of the US into the global South, in this case to Bolivia, where lithium, which is essential for battery production, is primarily mined, and eventually followed by solar technology and battery e-waste dispersed throughout Asia, South America, and Africa. Additionally, rarely considered are the fossil fuel sources used to supply the electricity for those private and public electric vehicles. And of course, most frequently, the poorest U.S. populations work in and live near those coal mines, power plants, fracking stations. The renewable energies movement claims that our global addiction to oil, black gold, should be replaced by lithium, white gold. What we are not considering is that extracting lithium and converting it to a commercially viable form consumes copious quantities of water, drastically depleting availability for indigenous communities and wildlife, and produces toxic waste that includes an already growing history of chemical leaks, poisoning rivers, thus people and other animals. Paul Hawkins' phrase, renewable materialism, quote unquote, warns us that this hyper-idealized shift from a fossil fuel paradigm to renewable energies, I'm not going to say renewable, is not a solution. Furthermore, these energies are low power density. They produce very little energy in proportion to the energy required to institutionalize them, infrastructuralize them. As the main character in Zazu Dreams warns, quote, even if we find great alternatives to fossil fuels, what if renewable energy become big business and just maintain our addiction to consumption? Replacing tar sands or oil drills or coal power plants with megalithic green energy is not the solution. It just masks the original problem, confusing freedom with free market and free enterprise. End quote. We must now act on our knowledge that the renewable revolution is dangerously carbon intensive. And as the authors of Deep Green Resistance remind us, quote, the new world of renewables will look exactly like the old in terms of exploitation, end quote. As all forms of climate chaos, climate crisis are interconnected, all forms of climate justice are equally interconnected. Like the metabolism of the human body and the Earth's tendency towards homeostasis, the metabolism of our culture must be scrutinized as a relational organism. An urgent embodiment of interdependency between environmental degradation and marginalized ethnic, racial, and economic communities, in conjunction with a sense of creative play, requires multilateral paradigm shifts. Catagenesis, pragmatic creative renewal, or creativity after catastrophe, is one coalitional path. This can include patterns in nature and multicultural models of symbiosis that counteract the paralysis of climate anxiety and climate grief. From this visceral commitment, we can cultivate regenerative economic tools for biocultural transformation, integrating rather than competing with our natural environment or isolating ourselves from it and from one another, as in what's happening with COVID-19 currently. Arundhati Roy invokes this vital political imagination. She says, that is why we must pay close attention to those with another imagination, an imagination outside of capitalism as well as communism. We will soon have to admit that those people, like the millions of indigenous people fighting to prevent the takeover of their lands and the destruction of their environment, the people who still know the secrets of sustainable living, are not relics of the past, but guides to our future. End quote. In his book on the disinformation age, Eric Chaffetz writes, quote, "The wisdom encoded in the indigenous cultures can provide answers to many questions. Many seemingly intractable problems could be resolved by bringing traditional ideas and values back to life. As we move into a post-imperialist age, the values central to those traditional cultures are the indigenous contribution to the reconstruction of a just and harmonious world." End quote. Similarly, in Zazu Dreams, I explore mutual justice and shared consciousness that for hundreds of generations throughout the Middle East, the Caribbean, and India have nourished coexistence between humans and nature. Again, the Ecozoic. Deep culturally sanctioned empathy emphasizes a re-spiritualization of nature that embraces community and self-regulatory equilibriums. In contrast with austerity, corporate bailouts, and increased profits for big pharma, big banks, big ag, big oil, big telecom, an energy democracy, a living democracy, that's Francis Moore Lapé's phrase. These democracies necessitate co-creative infrastructural design and implementation. Biopolitical ethics of radical empathy engenders sustainable environmental justice in which everyone is essential. Again, referring to the devastation of COVID-19's categorizing of essential and non-essential workers. Integrating cross-cultural socialist ecofeminism in relation to indigenous environmental philosophies, exemplified by women like Winona LaDuke or Quechua human rights activist Monica Chuji, is the ethic underlying the Ecozoic Era. Social permaculture and bioregional practices can help guide this transition because they do not simply replace environmental racism in the US with international green colonialism. They aim to eliminate global environmental hazards and human rights infractions that are currently implicit in the production, storage, and disposal of specious renewable energies. When we talk about practical steps, practicality often implies how the situation can adapt to our needs rather than how we can shift what we think we need. We must ask, how can we transform habitual behaviors of self-appointed privilege and obsessive accumulation so that we embody our enmeshments as a model and resource for compassionate living? How can we activate urgent collaborative action that does not reproduce the very challenges we are attempting to overcome? Through a commitment to deep inquiry and radical empathy, we can begin to see how, this is Eric Chaffetz's quote, the free market is a euphemism for economic terrorism, end quote. This awareness helps us transform our passive acceptance of exploitative patriarchy's everyday violence, entitlement, consumption, and ownership. Just as Gloria Anzaldua's writings, quote, complicate conventional notions of subjectivity and subjugation, end quote, this inquiry into the sanctity of normalcy alerts us to both our complicity and the power of our agency. Navigating our own extinction and the collapse of the known world, we witness not only our fears and failures, but also the exhilarating potential to radically transform our anthropocentric status quo that defines our species' hubris. If we bring attention to institutional misinformation and the fact that many of these institutions know that they are misrepresenting the facts, we can begin to understand how we can transform our individual and collective. This collective includes local communities ranging all the way up to transnational corporations. Our collective habitual behavior, how can we transform this? We can shift our production, consumption, disposal habits, offering nonviolent, symbiotic solutions that average citizens can adopt as we transition from our petroleum-pharmaceutical-addicted cyberculture to an economics of solidarity reminiscent of Charles Eisenstein's sacred economics. In conclusion, to be clear, I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't support alternative energies. My family drives a used electric car, and we utilize second-hand solar panels for our DC fridge. We use no other electricity in our converted school bus tiny home. We use second-hand, so again, I really want to emphasize the used factor. We use second-hand batteries for our solar energy storage. We also benefit from a micro hydroelectric system for our eco-village community's needs. While living on eco-villages across the world, I have found that my lifeway, passions, and desires were on the margins of the margins. In response, I teach and live the intricacies of the social scientific concepts of true cost, life cycle analysis, cradle to grave, and embodied energy, which includes designating local and global cycles of extraction, transportation, manufacture, assembly, production, installation, representation, distribution, consumption, disassembly, deconstruction, disposal, decomposition, containment. So all of this is basically the essence of embodied energy. When we converted a school bus to our tiny home for less than $5,000, including the bus, and in 30 days, my family and I succeeded in our commitment to use only salvaged materials, otherwise headed to landfill, a deeply personal social impact investment. We are like dung beetles that use others' waste to build our home and feed our family, or their family, or like sea slugs that eat debris off the ocean floor. Our home echoes Ubuntu, the Zhao people of South Africa's word meaning I am because you are, and the Mayan Enlak Ek, you are the other me. How we build our home is a direct commitment to local and global nonviolent environmental justice. It allows us to straddle the complexities of living in the modern world while maintaining our ecological and humanitarian ethics. These personal political practices recognize and nurture the sacred in everyday objects and the spaces, environments they inhabit. An Ecozoic Era reflects these manifestations of indigenous perspectives on kinship. Quechua Sumac Kusei's Buen Vivir, Buddhist inter-ar, interbeing, and socialist ecofeminist bioeconomies, cross-disciplinary, cross-cultural examples of community and empathy, co-implication, co-responsibility, that generate dialogic thinking and action. Ecozoic practices generate this creative response to colonialist legacies of economic oppression and extractive industries. When we implement social permaculture design infrastructure rooted in the commons, we debilitate how systemic economic violences, ranging from e-waste to 5G, AI, Internet of Things juggernaut, how these systemic violences are enmeshed. Recognizing, designing, and implementing emancipatory interrelationships co-creates humane infrastructures for every social system. This joyful, intercultural, interspecies approach to climate crisis mitigation weaves together simultaneous individual, community, and infrastructural change. Disrupting our homogenizing monoculture of the mind, and that's Vandana Shiva's phrase, monoculture of the mind. This strategy involves unlearning what we think we know while tapping into the fertility of our curiosity, beauty, and ever-evolving interconnectivity. And I'll end with two quotes, one from Zazu Dreams. I understood more and more that there was so much work to be done, that the only way to heal ethnic and racial divisions in the ecology of our global body is to see how we are all interconnected. We all have to take care of each other. Mary Oliver asks, tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? Thank you.